A remarkable headline this weekend of the Washington Post claims that possibly COVID-19 deaths and hospitalizations have been overcounted by the media and by the government. You don't say. Also, of course, Friday, the CDC and FDA raised some concerns about the mRNA shot that everyone is forced to take lest they lose their jobs and their livelihoods. Apparently that might be linked to heart conditions, stroke. You don't say. Whole lot of news stories suddenly coming out about this whole COVID-19 thing that, well, about a year ago, maybe even a few months ago, would have gotten you canceled. There was one man, a voice crying out in the wilderness about all of these things for the last couple of years. He is Chris DeGaulle, our friend, morning man for Salem Radio over there in Philadelphia, and now host of the brand new podcast. Well, it's not a new podcast, but it's new to the Salem family, the Chris DeGaulle Show podcast, available today on the Salem Podcast Network. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Larry, great to catch up with you in this new year. It's not the new year anymore, but new here with you and me.
Sure, absolutely. And when you see these headlines, Chris, you've got to just, I mean, part of you has to be amused, but at the same time, I don't know, infuriated that suddenly, the Washington Post thinks we may have been overcounting COVID deaths. Really?
Yes. There were people in our own industry, I don't have to bring this up. I won't name names, but you know who you are, who still at this hour hassle people about having this shot. There are people in this audience that are watching you tonight who lost their jobs because they didn't want to take this shot. Those of us who just raised our hand and said, this is still an emergency medicine that I may not want to inject in my system. May I ask a question? You selfish jerk, you're going to get people killed, they shouted. And now, whoops, it may hurt people.
Yeah. Maybe we should look into that. Well, maybe you should have. And of course, you can't sue the drug companies if you do have, God forbid, a horrific repercussion from these things. Oh, that's the other headline I've seen. People who are up to date on their shots and get frequent boosters, they might be more susceptible to catching the virus, Chris.
Yeah, this is no joke. The governor of Kansas, who's just been elected to her second term, Laura Kelly, she's given her, big governor's ball because she's won and she's got a big party. The next day, she's supposed to give the State of the State address. She postpones it because, I'm feeling a little under the weather. She tests positive for COVID. She has been quadruple infinity vaxxed and boosted and essentially hosted a super spreader event at the gala, if we're living under their old metrics.
Right.
The State of the State address scheduled for tomorrow night has been postponed as Kansas Governor Laura Kelly tested positive for COVID-19 this morning. The governor's office says it should not delay any plans to release details of the state budget on Thursday. The State of the State address is now scheduled for January 24th at 6:30 that evening.
So, the Democrats keep catching this thing. They've been vaccinated and boosted for I don't know, half a dozen times now?
Meanwhile, if you're a young man in peak physical condition, like a Navy SEAL or something, and even if you do catch COVID-19, the odds that it will affect you in a detrimental way is probably 0 to infinitesimal. You will get fired from the military. We've got, horrible military readiness problems right now if you don't get the vaccine, when you don't even need the vaccine when you're a strapping young man like that.
That's right. Well, and I remind you, Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General of Florida, is the only medical professional in government that I know of today who has come out very specifically and said young men should not take this shot.
Yeah.
Florida has very specifically said 18 to 44-year-old men should not take this shot. That's from the Florida Surgeon General, not you or me.
So we get that, and obviously going back to the original story, Lena Wen, who used to be the executive director of Planned Parenthood, she was on CNN telling everyone you have to get the shot or you're killing your grandmother, put a mask on.
You can remain unvaccinated if you so choose, but if you want to be in public and potentially could be infecting others with a dangerous and sometimes fatal disease that's highly transmissible, then there's an obligation of society. I mean, I think you could have an opt-out the way that France, for example, or Italy and other countries are doing, saying that if you want to be in bars, restaurants, movie theaters, etc., either be vaccinated or have proof of a recent negative test.
Now she's saying, maybe we overcounted some of these COVID deaths when we were remarking on the fact that, someone could die from a motorcycle accident, but they test positive for COVID and they're counted as a COVID death. Chris, there seems to be a palpable effort to rewrite history and get some kind of, suddenly for people to say, oh no, I was always on this side. I always saw through this stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've got all the receipts, don't we?
Yeah.
We've got hours of video and written records and tweets. We know who is hysterical. And by the way, I must confess, there are some people in our midst, fellow conservatives, who were hysterical and panicked. And look, I'm not saying that COVID there wasn't an era where we were all concerned and deeply confused and bothered, alarmed maybe even. But it's next level when you say everyone should mindlessly inject themselves with a new medicine and not ask questions. And if you do, you're a selfish jerk.
Yeah.
No, that's just good common sense. I mean, when I think about the amount of food testing that goes on in this country, safety tests, the reasons we recall things off the marketplace, much, much less. Oh, hurry and inject medicine that we don't know whether it fully works or not. That never made sense to me. I don't know about you.
Well, and listen, and recognizing the forces we were up against here. I mean, listen, I had gradations of acquiescence, let's say. In other words, I saw obviously how our children were being absolutely destroyed by not being allowed to go back to school. All right. And so when the powers that be said, well, if they go back to school, they have to wear masks. Like, fine. Just get them back to school. We'll fight the mask thing next, right? I get people who made those choices and made those arguments just so we could slowly get back to normal. But for God's sake, at this point, Chris, it seems pretty obvious what we need to do. And yet, as you said, we've still got the holdouts. We've still got people, dead enders. They're like the Japanese soldiers stuck in the cave 10 years after Hiroshima.
Yes, and what's really frightening is we were inching, I believe, incrementally closer to forcing this on kids. I'm convinced the Biden administration, if they could have figured out how to make every school child get this shot as a condition of going to school, I was convinced that was coming.
Yep.
I mean, I think we forget in all the Biden talk about documents and everything today, in my view, one of the most scandalous periods in American history, in recent American history, is using a Department of Labor to try to force millions of Americans to take a shot as a condition of earning a living.
Yep.
That's as abusive as anything I think we've ever lived through in modern American history.
Well,
all of us.
And the fact that Harmeet Dillon was the attorney who fought that fight, I think she should get the RNC chairman by acclamation just for that. But yes, that's a topic for another day. Although these are the kind of topics that you will get on a regular basis if you subscribe to the Chris DeGaulle Show podcast, which I do. Now, you've had the podcast for many years, Chris. I think, what are you in your 5th year now with the podcast?
We have entered our 4th year.
Okay.
And it's been a nice, I kind of just started it 3 years ago because I was in between jobs, as we often are in radio. I'm very happy to be home at Philadelphia's AM 990 The Answer. But back then I started it because I wasn't sure what to do. And today we crested 5 million downloads so far. And now we're part of the Salem podcast family and looking to grow from there. So I'm grateful to anybody that listens. I hope you will.
Yeah, it's so exciting so today is the first day that now that it's launched as part of the Salem podcast family, which is a huge, growing network of fantastic right of center conservative and Christian talk. And I'd love for you to sort of give people sort of a bit of a elevator pitch on what they hear, because you do talk about politics, but you talk about education, you talk about family, you talk about faith, you talk about everything that matters.
Well, thanks. I try, and that's what's sort of nice about a podcast format is you can delve into a lot of different things, talk a little about playoff football as the Philadelphia Eagles and my Kansas City Chiefs, by the way, both happen to be in it.
Yes,
how are things going there in Washington?
I'm sorry, we're almost out of time, Chris, so if you want to talk about the podcast that I'm so generously giving you time to plug, you might want to get to it.
So it's all those great things, yes, that we talk about. And yes, things like the vaccine, things like school choice, my wife and I are deeply invested in now, Christian education and themes of faith. Podcasting, I don't have to tell anybody who is a regular podcast consumer. It's endless. There's no time limits. There's no constraints. And most of all, it is consumer driven. If you like it, you listen. If you don't, you don't. It's the greatest free market listening there is, I think.
Sadly, no traffic and weather reports every 6 minutes, though, but we'll have to overcome that. Chris DeGaulle, my fellow morning man, he in the city of brotherly love, me in the city of brotherly hate here. And actually, can we say brotherly in this town anymore? I'm not sure. I'll look into it. Thanks, Chris. Download the Chris DeGaulle Show podcast and subscribe. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.